You want to know what it feels like to have your entire world shatter in 3 minutes? I was making Mark his coffee, 2 sugars stirred counterclockwise like always, when he delivered the blow that would change everything. "I'm leaving you, Sarah." His voice was cold, clinical. "I've found someone who actually inspires me. Jessica understands my ambitions in a way you never could." Jessica. His secretary. Of course. "You're just so ordinary, so predictable. I need more than this suburban housewife routine." Ordinary. The word hit me like a physical slap. 7 years of marriage, and that's what I was to him. Ordinary. The coffee mug slipped from my hands, shattering on the kitchen floor just like my heart. He stepped over the mess without looking back, wheeling his suitcase toward the door. "My lawyer will be in touch." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me standing. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. But standing there in the wreckage of my kitchen, his words echoing in my head, I couldn't help but think about how we got here. It wasn't always like this, was it? Or maybe it was, and I was just too blinded by love to see it. I remember the early days when Mark would listen to my ideas about his cases, how I'd suggest strategies over dinner and watch his eyes light up. "You're brilliant, Sarah," he'd say, kissing my forehead. But somewhere along the way, those conversations shifted. My suggestions became cute instead of brilliant. When I'd remind him of an idea I'd given him, he'd laugh and say, "Oh honey, you're misremembering." That was all me. Slowly, methodically, he chipped away at my confidence like water-eroding stone. When I suggested he take on that big corporate client 3 years ago, the one that made his career, he presented it to his partners as his own breakthrough insight. When I pointed out the flaw in his defense strategy for the Morrison case, he fixed it without acknowledgement, then took all the credit when they won. "You don't understand the complexities of law, Sarah," became his favorite phrase whenever I tried to contribute. At dinner parties, he'd introduce me as just my wife, while Jessica got introduced as his invaluable right hand. He'd talk over me mid-sentence, finish my thoughts incorrectly, then act like I was being dramatic when I'd try to correct him. "Sarah's a little sensitive," he'd tell people with that patronizing smile. I started speaking less, suggesting less, being less. I became smaller and smaller until I was exactly what he said I was. Ordinary, predictable, invisible. And the worst part? I believed him. I actually believed that I was lucky to have someone as successful and important as Mark, that I should be grateful he chose boring, ordinary me. How did I let myself disappear so completely that even I forgot who I used to be? The isolation started so subtly I didn't even notice it happening. My best friend Maya would call to invite me out, and Mark would sigh dramatically. "Really, Sarah? Girls' night again?" I thought we were past that college phase. He'd make me feel guilty for wanting to see my friends, like I was choosing them over our marriage. "Jessica never needs constant validation from her girlfriends," he'd say. "She's more mature than that." Gradually, I stopped making plans. When Maya would text, I'd make excuses. Mark had a work event, we had dinner plans, I was too tired. Eventually, she stopped asking. The same thing happened with my college friends, my book club, even my sister. Mark always had a reason why I shouldn't go, couldn't go, or why they were a bad influence on me. "They're just jealous of what we have," he'd say, pulling me close. "They want to break us up because they can't stand seeing you happy." But the worst part was how he systematically dismantled my professional confidence. Before Mark, I had a business degree from Northwestern. I'd worked in corporate finance for 5 years before we got married. I understood investments, market trends, portfolio management, but Mark made me feel like I knew nothing. When I'd suggest we diversify our retirement portfolio or question why he was putting everything into his friend's tech startup, he'd pat my head like I was a child. "Leave the financial decisions to me, sweetheart. You focus on making our home beautiful." He convinced me to quit my job 6 months after our wedding. "We don't need the money," he said. "Besides, Jessica handles all my business correspondence now. She has an MBA. An MBA I'd helped him pay for by working overtime while he was in law school, but apparently that didn't matter anymore. I became the wife who organized his dry cleaning, scheduled his dentist appointments, and smiled pretty at his work functions while he and Jessica discussed real business in the corner. I wasn't Sarah the financial analyst anymore. I was just Mark's wife, the one who made sure his shirts were pressed and his calendar was organized. The one who kept his life running smoothly so he could focus on important things like building a relationship with his secretary behind my back. After he left, I sat on that kitchen floor for hours, surrounded by broken ceramic and my own shattered sense of self. The silence in the house was deafening. No more of Mark's voice calling from his office. No more sounds of him getting ready for work. No more pretending everything was fine. Just me and the crushing weight of 7 years that apparently meant nothing. I kept replaying his words over and over. Ordinary, predictable. Was that really all I was? Had I become so invisible that even I couldn't see myself anymore? I found myself going through his things like some pathetic detective, looking for clues I'd missed, signs I should have seen. That's when I found his phone, the old one he'd left behind when he upgraded last month. My hands were shaking as I turned it on, telling myself I was just torturing myself, but I couldn't stop. The messages between him and Jessica went back 2 years. 2 years of "can't wait to see you," and "Sarah will never find out," and "she's so clueless, it's almost sad." They laughed about me. Actually laughed. Jessica called me the houseplant because I was always there but never really present. Mark agreed, saying I was useful for maintaining appearances but completely forgettable otherwise. They'd been together at conferences, weekend work trips, even in our own home when I was visiting my mother. The last message was from 3 days ago. Almost ready to pull the trigger. She'll be devastated, but honestly, it's time to put her out of her misery. She deserves someone as boring as she island. Put me out of my misery, like I was a wounded animal that needed to be euthanized. I threw that phone across the room and sobbed until I had nothing left. How had I become this person? This woman so forgettable that her own husband felt sorry for her. I was 34 years old, and I felt like my life was over before it had even really begun. 3 days later, I was still in the same pajamas, surviving on stale crackers and self-pity, when Maya showed up at my door. I hadn't called her honestly. I was too ashamed to admit that Mark had been right about me all along. But Maya had always been intuitive like that. She took one look at my red, swollen eyes and pushed past me into the house. "Oh, honey," she said, wrapping me in the kind of hug that makes you realize how starved you've been. I heard through the grapevine that Mark finally showed his true colors. I've been waiting for this call for years. Waiting for this call? Sarah, sweetheart, you've been so deep in his manipulation that you can't even see yourself anymore. Do you remember who you were before him? You were the girl who graduated summa cum laude with a finance degree. You were the one who could spot a bad investment from a mile away and talk circles around those Wall Street bros in your first job. She was pacing now, getting fired up in that way only Maya could. You helped 3 different companies restructure their entire portfolios. You saved your old firm millions with your risk assessment strategies. And then you met Mark and somehow convinced yourself that none of that mattered. I wanted to argue with her, to say that Mark was successful and important, and I was just a support system. But the words felt hollow now. Maya, you don't understand. I really am ordinary. I've been playing house for 7 years while he built an actual career. She stopped pacing and stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Ordinary? Sarah, do you remember what you inherited from your grandmother? My grandmother. I'd almost forgotten in all this chaos. You mean the building downtown? Not just any building, love. A prime piece of commercial real estate in the heart of the financial district. Do you have any idea what that's worth now? What kind of rental income that generates? I didn't, actually. I'd barely thought about it since Grandma Rose passed 5 years ago. The property management company handled everything, depositing rent checks into an account I rarely looked at. Sarah, Maya said gently, you're not just ordinary. You're not even just financially independent. You're wealthy. And unless I'm mistaken, you never told Mark about any of it, did you? Maya was right. I had never told Mark about the building. And sitting there on my couch, I finally remembered why. It was 5 years ago when Grandma Rose passed away. I was still so desperate to please Mark back then, still believing that being a good wife meant being small and undemanding. The reading of the will was on a Tuesday morning, and Mark had this huge case he was preparing for, so I went alone. I expected maybe some family jewelry, perhaps a small savings account. Grandma Rose had always lived modestly in her little apartment. But when the lawyer started reading, my whole world shifted. She'd left me the entire commercial building at 5th and Main, 12 floors of prime downtown real estate that she'd bought back in 1972 for almost nothing and watched grow into one of the most valuable properties in the city. Your grandmother was quite the businesswoman, the lawyer said with a smile. She saw potential where others saw urban decay. The property management company she'd hired decades ago had been running it flawlessly, keeping it fully occupied with law firms, accounting practices, and consulting companies. The monthly rental income was more than Mark made in 6 months, and I just sat there in stunned silence, holding the deed to my financial independence. When I got home that day, Mark was on the phone with Jessica about some legal brief, barely looking up when I walked in. "How was the will reading, honey? Did she leave you her china set?" His tone was so dismissive, so certain that nothing important could possibly happen in my boring little life. Something inside me held back. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was the way he'd been making me feel smaller and smaller each day, but I just said, "Oh, just some family mementos. Nothing exciting." He nodded absently and went back to his call. And I went upstairs to hide the paperwork in my old college textbooks, the ones he'd suggested I donate because we don't need reminders of your student days cluttering up the house. From that day forward, I let the property management company handle everything quietly, never mentioning the quarterly statements that came to a P.O. box I'd opened secretly. It was like having a completely separate life that Mark knew nothing about. Now, sitting here after he'd called me ordinary and left me for someone more inspiring, I was starting to realize that maybe my secret wasn't just about money. Maybe it was about the part of me that had never trusted him completely, the part that knew I needed to protect something that was truly mine. That night, after Maya left with promises to check on me daily until I stopped being a zombie, I did something I hadn't done in years. I used my brain for something other than Mark's convenience. I opened my laptop and started digging into Jessica's life, like the financial analyst I used to be, the one who could research companies and find red flags that others missed. Jessica Martinez, 28, MBA, from a decent but not spectacular state school, had been working as Mark's secretary for 3 years, but as I scrolled through her carefully curated social media, a timeline started emerging that made my stomach turn. There was a photo of her at the law firm's Christmas party 2 years ago, standing just a little too close to Mark while I was home with the flu. Another from their business conference in Chicago 18 months ago, a conference I'd suggested Mark attend after reading an article about new corporate litigation strategies. The conference where he came home unusually attentive and guilty, buying me flowers for no reason, and insisting we go to that expensive restaurant I'd mentioned months earlier. I remembered being so happy that he was finally listening to me again, finally seeing me. God, I was such an idiot. The deeper I dug, the more I found. Jessica's Instagram was full of subtle hints, expensive jewelry that appeared around the time Mark got his promotion, weekend trips to places I recognized from his business travel receipts, restaurant check-ins during times when he'd told me he was working late. She'd even posted a photo of the coffee shop across from our house 6 months ago with the caption, "Sometimes the best view is the one you're not supposed to have." She'd been stalking my life, watching me from afar while she planned to take my place. But the worst discovery came when I found her LinkedIn profile. Under her experience at Mark's firm, she'd listed strategic planning and business development, the exact same phrase I'd used to describe my suggestions to Mark over the years. She was literally taking credit for my ideas, my contributions to his success, and he was letting her. They weren't just having an affair, they were having an affair built on erasing me completely. Every breakthrough he'd had in the past 2 years, every successful case strategy, every career advancement I could trace it back to conversations he'd had with me. Ideas I'd given him that Jessica was now claiming as collaborative efforts. I wasn't just being replaced, I was being rewritten out of my own life story. But as I closed the laptop that night, something had shifted in me. For the first time in years I felt sharp again, focused. And I was starting to remember what it felt like to be the woman who used to dismantle bad business deals for breakfast. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 5 years. I got dressed in my best business attire and drove downtown to see my building. Actually see it, not just drive past it like some tourist landmark I happened to own. Walking into the marble lobby, I felt this strange mix of pride and disbelief. This was mine. All 12 floors of gleaming steel and glass, humming with the energy of successful businesses. The property manager, Helen Chen, was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd been running the building since before my grandmother died. "Miss Sarah," she said warmly when I called up to her office. "I was wondering when you'd finally come see your empire." Empire? I liked the sound of that. Helen walked me through everything: occupancy rates at 98%, a waiting list of companies desperate to lease space, rental income that had doubled since I'd inherited it thanks to the neighborhood's gentrification. "Your grandmother taught me to be very selective about tenants," Helen explained as we toured the upper floors. "We only lease to established businesses with solid credit and long-term stability. Speaking of which, we have several leases coming up for renewal this year." My heart stopped when she handed me the list. There it was, in black and white. Hartwell, Morrison, Associates, Mark's law firm, occupying the entire 8th floor. They'd been my tenants for 3 years, paying me $45,000 a month in rent without Mark ever knowing he was making his estranged wife wealthy every time he signed his paychecks. "The Hartwell firm is one of our most reliable tenants," Helen continued, oblivious to the irony. "Their lease expires next month, and they've already expressed interest in expanding to a 9th floor if we have space available." I stared at that name on the paper, and something cold and calculating settled into my chest. Mark thought I was ordinary, predictable, forgettable. He thought he'd left me with nothing but broken dishes and wounded pride. But Mark had made one crucial mistake. In his 7 years of systematic emotional destruction, he'd underestimated exactly how smart I really was, and he had absolutely no idea that he'd been paying rent to his ordinary wife for 3 years. Helen was still talking about lease renewals and expansion possibilities, but all I could think was, Mark wants to expand his office space. How interesting. I wonder what his landlord will think about that. Sitting in Helen's office, staring at that lease agreement with Mark's firm name printed in bold letters, I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. For 3 years, every month, Mark had been contributing to rent payments that went directly into my bank account. Every time he bragged about his successful practice, every time he condescended to me about not understanding business, every time he made me feel small and financially dependent, he was literally paying me. The monthly deposit I'd been ignoring, thinking it was just some modest rental income from Grandma Rose's little investment, was actually my husband funding my independence without knowing it. "Helen," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady, "can you walk me through exactly how much Hartwell, Morrison, Associates pays annually?" She pulled out her calculator with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for decades. $45,000 monthly, so $540,000 annually. They're actually one of our highest-paying tenants because they wanted that corner space with the harbor view. $540,000 per year. Mark's firm was paying me more than $500,000 annually, while he told me I didn't understand money and should leave financial decisions to him. The cruel irony was almost beautiful in its completeness. I thought about all those times he'd criticized my spending, how he'd made me feel guilty for buying groceries without checking with him first, how he'd insisted I didn't need my own credit card because, we're married, what's mine is yours. Meanwhile, his law firm's success was literally built on a foundation that I owned, in a building that I inherited, generating wealth that I controlled completely. "And their lease is up for renewal when exactly?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. "Next month, actually. Mr. Hartwell himself called last week asking about expansion options. Apparently they're doing very well, and want to add another conference room and a few more associate offices. Mark wanted to expand. Mark, who had just left his ordinary wife for being too predictable, wanted to grow his business in a building owned by the woman he'd just called forgettable. The same woman he thought would be devastated and helpless without him. I looked out Helen's window at the harbour view that Mark's firm was paying premium prices to enjoy, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I smiled. Not a sad, broken smile, but something sharp and calculating. Mark thought he held all the cards, but he'd been playing poker while sitting at my table the entire time. After leaving the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, so I did what any good analyst would do. I followed the money trail. That evening, I pulled out all our joint bank statements from the past 2 years, something I'd stopped monitoring when Mark convinced me I was too emotional about finances. What I found made my blood run cold, but not from sadness this time, from pure, calculated fury. There were transfers I'd never authorized, withdrawals that coincided perfectly with Jessica's social media posts about her expensive new lifestyle. A $5,000 business expense the same week Jessica posted about her weekend in Napa. A $10,000 withdrawal labeled client entertainment that matched exactly with the cost of the diamond bracelet she'd been flaunting on Instagram. But the real smoking gun was in Mark's personal account statements, which I still had access to since he'd never bothered to remove me. Monthly deposits that didn't match his salary, labeled as consulting fees and bonus payments. I cross-referenced the dates with his firm's quarterly reports, which were public record since they handled municipal contracts. The numbers didn't add up. Mark wasn't just cheating on me with Jessica, he was stealing from his own firm to fund their relationship, using our joint accounts as a laundering mechanism. The man who'd called me too ordinary to understand business had been running a sloppy embezzlement scheme that any first-year forensic accountant could spot. And now I had documented proof of every single transaction. Mark thought he'd left me with nothing, but he'd actually handed me enough evidence to destroy him completely. The ordinary housewife he'd discarded was about to become his worst nightmare. The next few days, I became a woman possessed, but in the best possible way. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again, like the sharp, capable analyst who used to tear apart financial statements and spot inconsistencies that others missed. I created spreadsheets documenting every suspicious transaction, printed bank statements, screenshot Jessica's social media posts with timestamps, and cross-referenced everything with Mark's firm's public financial records. Maya came over every evening, bringing coffee and moral support while I worked at our dining room table, like some kind of forensic accountant on a mission. "Sarah, this is incredible," she said, reviewing my evidence files. "You've basically built an airtight case for embezzlement, and you've got documentation going back 2 years. Any prosecutor would kill for evidence this clean." But Maya, being the brilliant lawyer she was, helped me think 3 steps ahead. "The question is, what do you want to achieve here? Do you want him in prison, or do you want him destroyed professionally, or do you want maximum leverage in the divorce?" We spent hours strategizing, and I realized that what I wanted most was for Mark to understand exactly how badly he'd underestimated me. I wanted him to know that his ordinary wife was actually the architect of his downfall. "Here's what we're going to do," I told Maya, feeling more confident than I had in years. "First, I'm going to use my position as his landlord to apply pressure. Then, when he's already feeling vulnerable, I'll reveal what I know about the embezzlement. But I want him to figure out piece by piece that I'm not the helpless victim he thinks he left behind." Maya grinned and raised her coffee mug in a toast. "To the woman who's about to remind her cheating husband that underestimating smart women is always a fatal mistake." As I clinked my mug against hers, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 7 years. I felt powerful. Not because I was angry or vengeful, but because I was finally using my brain again, finally trusting my instincts, finally remembering that I was never ordinary. I was strategic, methodical, and absolutely brilliant when I wanted to be. Mark was about to learn that the hard way. The beauty of owning a building is that you can make life very uncomfortable for your tenants in completely legal ways, and they'll never see it coming. My first call was to Helen, and I could practically hear her smiling through the phone when I explained that I wanted to take a more hands-on approach to building management. "I think it's time we conducted some overdue inspections," I told her. "Fire safety, flak efficiency, structural assessments, all those things responsible landlords should be monitoring regularly." Within days, Mark's firm started experiencing what could only be described as death by 1,000 cuts. The building inspector I hired was thorough, professional, and absolutely relentless about code compliance. Suddenly, Hartwell, Morrison, Bike Associates had to deal with emergency fire system testing during their busiest client meetings, HVAC inspections that required shutting down power to half their floor, and structural engineers who needed access to their conference room walls during depositions. I had Helen schedule all the routine maintenance during their peak business hours because apparently the building's insurance policy required it. Their internet went down twice for necessary cable upgrades. Their elevators were out of service for safety recertification. And the water pressure mysteriously dropped every time they tried to use their fancy client bathroom. The best part was watching it all unfold through the building's security cameras that I now had access to. Mark looked increasingly frazzled, constantly on the phone with Helen's office, demanding to know why everything was falling apart at once. His partners were getting irritated, clients were complaining, and Jessica kept rolling her eyes every time another maintenance worker showed up with clipboards and equipment. "This building used to be so well managed," I heard Mark complaining to his secretary through the intercom system that fed to Helen's office. "I don't know what's gotten into the landlord lately. They're being completely unreasonable about these inspections." Unreasonable. That was rich, coming from the man who'd spent 7 years being unreasonable about my intelligence, my worth, and my right to have opinions. But this was just the beginning. Mark thought his biggest problem was a demanding landlord he'd never met. He had no idea that his real problem was sitting in her pajamas in his former kitchen, sipping coffee and planning his professional destruction with the methodical precision of someone who'd finally remembered how good she was at taking apart things that didn't add up. By the 3rd week of my strategic campaign, Mark was unraveling in the most satisfying way possible. Helen had been feeding me daily reports about his increasingly frantic phone calls, and I was getting a front-row seat to his breakdown through the building's security system. The man who'd always prided himself on being calm and controlled was now snapping at his staff, pacing his office during client calls, and developing what looked like a stress-induced eye twitch. "Miss Chen," I heard him pleading during one particularly entertaining conversation. "You have to understand that these constant interruptions are costing my firm thousands of dollars in lost productivity. Can't you schedule these inspections during off hours?" But Helen, bless her professional heart, stuck to our script perfectly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartwell, but our new building owner is very particular about safety compliance. All inspections must be conducted during peak hours to ensure systems are tested under normal operating conditions." The new building owner. I loved how ominous that sounded. Then came the coup de grace, the lease renewal notice. Helen delivered it personally, explaining that due to recent changes in building ownership and management philosophy, all existing leases were under comprehensive review. "Review?" Mark's voice cracked slightly. "We've been model tenants for 3 years. Our rent has never been late, we've caused no property damage, we've even upgraded some of the office features at our own expense." "I understand your concerns," Helen replied smoothly, "but the new owner has very specific criteria for tenant retention. They're looking for businesses that align with their values of integrity, transparency, and ethical business practices. There will be a thorough background check on all partners and associates, financial auditing of your firm's practices, and character references from previous landlords." I watched through the camera as Mark's face went pale. A financial audit, character references, background checks. For someone who'd been embezzling from his own firm and lying to his wife for 2 years, those words must have sounded like a death sentence. He started stammering about his firm's impeccable reputation, but I could see the panic in his eyes. The ordinary, predictable wife he'd abandoned was systematically dismantling his sense of security, and he didn't even know it yet, but he was about to. The meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Thursday, in the building's executive conference room on the 12th floor, the one with the panoramic harbour view that Mark had always admired during the rare times he'd been up there for building events. Helen had called his office 3 days prior, explaining that the building owner wanted to meet with all major tenants to discuss lease renewals personally. "It's highly unusual," she'd told Mark, "but they're very particular about the businesses they want to maintain relationships with." I spent an hour getting ready that morning, choosing my best business suit, the charcoal grey Armani I'd bought for job interviews before Mark convinced me I didn't need to work. I styled my hair in the sleek professional look I used to wear to client meetings, applied makeup with the precision of someone preparing for battle, and slipped on the diamond earrings my grandmother had left me alongside the building. When I walked into that conference room, Mark was already seated with his 2 partners, looking nervous and slightly sweaty despite the perfectly controlled temperature. They all stood when I entered, and I watched Mark's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and absolute horror in the span of 3 seconds. "Gentlemen," I said, settling into the chair at the head of the table with the calm authority I'd forgotten I possessed. "Thank you for coming. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I own this building." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's mouth opened and closed like he was trying to speak underwater, while his partners looked between us with growing bewilderment. "I believe you know my soon-to-be ex-husband. I continued, gesturing toward Mark with the same casual dismissiveness he'd always used when introducing me at parties. He used to tell people I was just his wife, too ordinary to understand business. But as it turns out, he's been paying rent to his ordinary wife for 3 years, without even knowing it. Mark finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, what is this? What are you doing?" I smiled then, the kind of smile that held 7 years of suppressed intelligence and carefully hidden strength. "I'm conducting a business meeting, Mark. You know, the kind of important grown-up conversation you always said I wouldn't understand. Now, shall we discuss your lease renewal, or would you prefer to explain to your partners why you've been embezzling from the firm to fund your affair with your secretary?" The colour drained from Mark's face so completely that I thought he might actually faint right there in my conference room. His partners, David Hartwell and Jim Morrison, were looking between us like they'd walked into the wrong movie, trying to process how their colleague's estranged wife had suddenly become their landlord and was casually mentioning embezzlement like she was discussing the weather. "This is impossible," Mark stammered, gripping the edge of the table. "You don't own anything. You don't have money. You've never even had a job that mattered." Even in his shock, he couldn't help but diminish me, and I felt that familiar surge of vindication. "Actually, Mark, I've had a very important job for the past 3 years. I've been your landlord. Every month when you signed those rent checks, every time you bragged about your Harbour View office, every time you told me I didn't understand business, you were literally paying me to prove you wrong." That's when Jessica appeared in the doorway, probably wondering why Mark's meeting was running long and wanting to insert herself into whatever important business conversation was happening. The look on her face when she saw me sitting at the head of the table was almost as priceless as Mark's. "What is she doing here?" Jessica demanded, stepping into the room like she owned it. "Mark, why is your ex-wife in our building?" "Her building," I corrected pleasantly. "And you must be Jessica, the inspiring woman who understands Mark's ambitions so much better than I do. Tell me, do you also understand that he's been stealing from this firm to pay for your expensive taste? Because I have 2 years of bank records that suggest you've been accessories to embezzlement." Jessica's confident smirk evaporated instantly. She looked at Mark, who was now sweating through his expensive shirt, then back at me with growing panic. "Mark, what is she talking about?" But Mark couldn't answer because he was finally understanding the scope of what had just happened to him. His ordinary, predictable, forgettable wife wasn't just his landlord. She was his judge, jury, and executioner. And she'd been planning this moment with the precision of the brilliant analyst he'd spent 7 years trying to convince her she wasn't. The woman he'd underestimated was about to destroy him using nothing but the truth and the power he never knew she had. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the folder I'd been preparing for weeks, placing it on the table with the same calm efficiency I'd once used to present investment analyses to corporate boards. "Since we're all here, let me walk you through what I've discovered about your business practices, Mark. Between January 2023 and present day, you've made 37 unauthorized transfers from client escrow accounts, totaling $215,000. You've also been padding expense reports and billing personal purchases as business expenses, meals, travel, jewelry, even Jessica's apartment deposit." I opened the folder and spread out bank statements, highlighted transaction records, and printed screenshots with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent years analyzing financial irregularities. "Everything here is documented and cross-referenced. The $5,000 dinner at Le Bernardin that you claimed was a client meeting. Your client was in London that week. The $10,000 weekend in Cabo that went through the business account. Your firm had no cases in Mexico. The $15,000 bracelet that showed up on Jessica's Instagram the same day as a mysterious cash withdrawal from the Morrison Trust account. Well, that's just sloppy." David and Jim were staring at the evidence with growing horror while Mark sat frozen, probably calculating how many years in prison his stupidity had earned him. "Now," I continued, my voice never rising above a professional tone, "here's what's going to happen. You have exactly 24 hours to return every stolen dollar to this firm's accounts, resign from your partnership, and sign a confession detailing your embezzlement. In exchange, your partners won't press criminal charges, and I won't forward this evidence to the State Bar Association immediately." I paused, letting that sink in. "Additionally, you'll sign an uncontested divorce agreement giving me everything I'm legally entitled to, which, given that you've been stealing marital assets to fund your affair, is considerable." You'll also vacate our house by this weekend, and you'll never contact me again unless it's through lawyers. Mark finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate. Sarah, please, we can work this out. I made mistakes, but you can't destroy my entire life over this. I stood up then, smoothing my skirt with the calm authority of someone who'd finally remembered exactly how powerful she'd always been. Mark, you destroyed your own life the moment you decided that your ordinary wife was too stupid to notice you stealing money and too weak to fight back. You were wrong on both counts. The 24 hours that followed were the most pathetic display I'd ever witnessed from a man who used to call himself successful. Mark called me 17 times that first day, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that ranged from anger to bargaining to outright begging. Sarah, you're being vindictive, started the angry phase. Then came the bargaining. We can split everything 50-50. I'll pay back the money. We can even go to counseling. But by hour 18, it was pure desperation. Please. Sarah, I'm sorry. I know I hurt you, but don't destroy me like this. I'll do anything. Meanwhile, Jessica's reaction was everything I'd hoped for, and more. Within 6 hours of our meeting, she'd blocked Mark on all social media, changed her relationship status back to single, and was already posting photos with some new guy she'd apparently had waiting in the wings. When Mark showed up at her apartment that night, something I knew because Maya had volunteered to do some reconnaissance, Jessica wouldn't even let him inside. I'm not going down with your sinking ship, she told him through the door, loud enough for Maya to hear from the parking lot. Find someone else to save your pathetic career. His partners moved even faster than Jessica. By noon the next day, David and Jim had called an emergency meeting with the firm's board, accepted my evidence package, and voted unanimously to terminate Mark's partnership immediately. They also froze all his accounts, launched their own internal investigation, and sent a formal notice to the State Bar Association. We want you to know that we had no knowledge of Mr. Mitchell's activities, David told me in a phone call that afternoon. This firm has maintained impeccable ethical standards for 15 years, and we won't let one man's greed destroy our reputation. When Mark realized that his career, his girlfriend, his partners, and his leverage had all evaporated in less than 24 hours, he finally understood something crucial. The ordinary woman he'd discarded wasn't just smart enough to catch him, she was strategic enough to dismantle his entire life, using nothing but patience, documentation, and the power he never knew she possessed. He signed everything I put in front of him without reading it, including papers that gave me the house, both cars, and a settlement that would keep me comfortable for the rest of my life. The man who'd told me I was too predictable to inspire him had just learned that smart women are the most dangerous opponents, precisely because everyone underestimates them. By the end of that week, Mark's world had completely collapsed in the most beautifully systematic way imaginable. The eviction proceedings against his law firm were swift and merciless. Helen filed the paperwork citing breach of lease terms related to illegal business activities, and within 10 days, Hartwell, Morrison, Associates was forced to vacate the 8th floor of my building. Watching the movers cart out Mark's desk, his diplomas, his precious Harbour View conference table, I felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost spiritual. The divorce settlement was equally devastating for him and liberating for me. Since Mark had used our joint assets to fund his embezzlement scheme, the court awarded me our house, both vehicles, his entire retirement account, and half of his remaining assets after restitution to his former firm. My lawyer, who happened to be Maya's colleague and absolutely loved cases involving cheating husbands, made sure that Mark would be paying me alimony for the next 5 years, a delicious irony considering he'd spent our marriage making me feel financially helpless. But the real justice came in, watching his professional reputation crumble across the legal community. The State Bar Association launched a formal investigation that would likely result in his disbarment. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit world of corporate law, and Mark went from being a rising star to being radioactive in the span of 2 weeks. No firm would touch him, not even as a paralegal. Jessica, meanwhile, had seamlessly transitioned to dating one of Mark's former competitors, posting Instagram photos from expensive restaurants with captions like, "Upgrade complete," and "Sometimes you have to trade down before you can trade up." The ultimate insult was that Mark had to move back in with his parents at 38 years old, driving a used Honda because I'd kept the BMW, and working at a small-town law office, that specialized in divorce cases, the only firm desperate enough to hire a disgraced attorney with embezzlement charges on his record. 3 months after he'd called me ordinary and walked out of our kitchen, Mark Mitchell had lost his career, his money, his girlfriend, his partners, his reputation, and his dignity. Meanwhile, his predictable ex-wife was living in their beautiful house, managing a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate portfolio, and finally using her brilliant mind for something that mattered. The best part? Every month when I reviewed my building's financial reports, I saw the empty 8th floor that used to house his firm, and I remembered that sometimes the most ordinary-looking people are actually the most dangerous ones to underestimate. 6 months later, I was a completely different woman, not because I'd changed who I was, but because I'd finally remembered who I'd always been underneath Mark's systematic erosion of my confidence. I'd taken over active management of my building, working closely with Helen to expand our portfolio and acquire 2 more commercial properties downtown. Turns out I had a natural talent for real estate investment and tenant relations, probably because I understood what it felt like to be undervalued and overlooked. But the most rewarding part of my new life was the support group I'd started for women going through messy divorces, especially those whose husbands had controlled their finances or made them feel incompetent. Every Tuesday night, 8 to 10 women gathered in my living room to share stories, review financial documents, and learn how to protect themselves legally and financially. Maya helped with the legal advice, and I taught them how to dig through bank records, spot financial red flags, and document evidence of hidden assets or suspicious spending. "You're like a divorce detective," one woman told me after I'd helped her discover that her husband had been hiding money in cryptocurrency accounts. "You taught me that being detail-oriented isn't boring, it's powerful." I'd also started dating someone new, a fellow building owner named David, who appreciated my business acumen and actually asked for my opinion on investment strategies. Our first date was reviewing property assessments over coffee, and when I mentioned that I'd destroyed my ex-husband's career using nothing but spreadsheets and patience, David's response was, "That's the sexiest thing I've ever heard. He never made me feel like I needed to be smaller, quieter, or less intelligent to make him comfortable." Instead, he celebrated the fact that I could spot a bad business deal from 3 blocks away and had turned my personal betrayal into a masterclass in strategic thinking. When people asked me how I'd moved on so completely from Mark's abandonment, I always told them the same thing. I didn't move on from being ordinary, because I was never ordinary to begin with. I just stopped letting someone else's insecurity convince me that my intelligence, my intuition, and my strength were somehow too much for the world to handle. Mark had called me predictable, but what he'd really meant was that he could predict I'd never fight back. That was the only prediction of his that turned out to be completely, catastrophically wrong. A year later, I was sitting in my new office on the 12th floor of my building, the corner space, with the harbour view that Mark's firm used to occupy, reviewing proposals from 3 different companies desperate to lease the space. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now literally occupying the throne that Mark had built his arrogance upon, but the view felt different when you owned it instead of just borrowing it. I'd learned something profound about myself through this whole ordeal. I wasn't ordinary because I was quiet, and I wasn't predictable because I was patient. I was strategic, methodical, and absolutely lethal when someone underestimated my intelligence. Mark had spent 7 years trying to convince me that my worth was tied to his approval, that my ideas only mattered if he validated them, that my existence was only meaningful as an extension of his success. But the truth was, I'd been building my own empire the entire time, I just hadn't realized it yet. The woman who'd stood in that kitchen a year ago, crying over broken coffee mugs and shattered dreams, had always possessed everything she needed to destroy the man who tried to diminish her. She just needed someone to push her far enough to remember how powerful she really was. These days, I wake up every morning in my beautiful house, check the financial reports from my growing real estate portfolio, and smile at the messages from women whose lives I've helped rebuild. David brings me coffee in bed and asks for my advice on his latest property acquisition. Maya stops by every week to celebrate whatever new victory we've achieved together. And sometimes, very rarely, I think about Mark not with anger or sadness, but with something that might almost be gratitude. Because if he hadn't been arrogant enough to call me ordinary, cruel enough to abandon me, and stupid enough to underestimate me, I might never have discovered that the most dangerous thing you can do to a smart woman is convince her she's powerless. I learned that revenge isn't about being vindictive, it's about being strategic. It's about using your intelligence to expose the truth, protect yourself, and build something better from the ashes of what someone else destroyed. And most importantly, I learned that the word ordinary is only an insult if you let other people define what extraordinary looks like. Mark thought extraordinary meant loud, aggressive, and showy. But I know now that extraordinary can also be quiet, patient, and absolutely devastating when the moment is right. The next chapter of my life is just beginning, and this time I'm writing it myself.